The church smelled faintly of pine and old hymn books. Morning light slipped through the stained glass, painting soft colors across wooden pews. The congregation had gathered like they did every Sunday, quiet chatter, shuffling feet, the low hum of the organ warming up. But that morning felt different, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Near the front row sat a small boy, maybe 8 years old, fidgeting with a folded piece of paper he'd drawn on. His grandmother whispered something to him, probably telling him to sit still. He didn't. His eyes were fixed on the man standing by the pulpit, Pastor Bob Joyce. He wasn't a tall man, but when he spoke, his presence filled the room. There was something about his voice, deep, velvety, almost too familiar. When he greeted the church with a smile and a gentle good morning, a few people glanced at each other knowingly. That sound, that tone, it carried a ghost. For years, whispers had followed him like a shadow. He sounds just like Elvis. Some swore it wasn't just resemblance. They swore it was him, older, softer, reborn under another name. Pastor Bob had heard it all before. Every rumor, every theory, every YouTube video dissecting the curve of his jaw or the tremble in his voice. He laughed about it sometimes, but deep down it weighed on him. People didn't just want faith from him, they wanted resurrection. And that was a burden no man should carry. Still, he never let it show. His sermons were about peace, humility, and finding truth in love. He spoke like someone who had already lived too many lives, and maybe, in a way, he had. That morning he sang a hymn before the message, Amazing Grace. The church fell silent as his voice filled the air. Rich, warm, hauntingly smooth. It didn't just sound like Elvis, it felt like him. A few people wiped their eyes. Even the boy in the front pew stopped fidgeting, staring with wide eyes. When the last note faded, the boy whispered something to his grandmother, who shook her head and pressed a finger to his lips. But innocence doesn't know restraint. As Pastor Bob began to step down from the pulpit, the boy stood, heart pounding, voice trembling. Pastor Bob, are you Elvis? The words hung in the air like lightning waiting for thunder. Every head turned. A few people gasped softly. Someone let out a nervous laugh, hoping to dissolve the tension, but it only made the silence heavier. Bob froze mid-step. He looked at the child, not with anger, not with shock, but with something else, something almost tender. He'd heard that question before, shouted from strangers outside, whispered in grocery aisles, sent in letters begging for answers. But hearing it from a child hit differently. Because children don't accuse or idolize, they believe. Their questions aren't loaded with judgment or curiosity. They come from a place of pure wonder. Bob took a slow breath, his eyes softened. Why do you ask that, son? The boy hesitated. Because you sound like him, and when you sing, I feel like he's here again. The church collectively exhaled, a mix of awe and discomfort. Some smiled sadly, others looked down. They all wanted to know too. Bob's lips curled into a faint smile. That's a kind thing to say, he murmured. Thank you. But he didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, he rested his hand on the pulpit, staring at the cross above the altar. His heart was beating slower now, heavy and full. He'd spent years running from that question, not because he feared it, but because it missed the point entirely. The truth wasn't about who he was, it was about who he became. After the service, people lingered longer than usual. Conversations buzzed like low static, laughter mixed with speculation. Did you hear what that little boy said? He handled it so gracefully. I swear the way he smiled, that was Elvis's smile. Outside, the church's wooden sign creaked in the wind, Grace Point Fellowship. Pastor Bob Joyce. That name had become a magnet. Pilgrims of curiosity came from every corner of the country, some carrying Bibles, others carrying old vinyl records. They'd sit in the back pews, recording him on their phones, waiting for clues, a phrase, a gesture, a laugh that might reveal what they hoped was true. Bob knew what they were searching for. They weren't looking for him. They were looking for a man they'd lost long ago. A man who'd been larger than life, yet desperately human underneath it all. They missed Elvis Presley, not just the performer, but the soul behind the spectacle. He often wondered if Elvis ever truly rested. The legend was buried, yes, but the myth refused to die. Sometimes, after a long day, Bob would sit alone in the quiet of his small office, the hum of the air conditioner and the faint smell of old leather-bound Bibles around him, and whisper a prayer not for forgiveness, but for understanding. Because even if he wasn't Elvis Presley, he knew that burden, being loved for the wrong reasons, being seen but never truly known. In the stillness, memories that weren't his own seemed to drift through his thoughts, the roar of a crowd, the blinding lights, the loneliness that came when applause faded. Maybe it was empathy, or maybe it was something deeper. Either way, he carried it gently. The first rumors had started online years ago. A blurry video of Pastor Bob singing "Who Am I" during a service had gone viral. The resemblance was uncanny. Comment sections exploded. "That's him. He's alive. Elvis found God and changed his name." Some mocked it, others built entire channels around it, piecing together timelines, comparing photos, analyzing the grain of his voice like detectives solving a mystery that refused to stay buried. Bob didn't fight it. He simply kept preaching, kept singing, kept smiling. When reporters tried to contact him, he politely declined interviews. "Let the music speak," he'd say, and it did. Because when he sang, people cried. They said they felt peace, the kind of peace Elvis himself had spent his whole life chasing but never quite caught. He used to joke that if he really was Elvis, he'd ask for a raise. The congregation would laugh and the tension would ease. But there were moments, quiet, fragile moments, when that question pierced deeper than he let on, because beneath the humor there was pain. He had seen what fame did to a man's soul, how it built walls made of gold and glass, beautiful but impossible to escape. How it made you feel like a god on stage and a ghost when the lights went out. Maybe that's why he never tried to prove or disprove the rumors. Maybe, in some unspoken way, Bob Joyce was protecting something sacred, not just himself, but the memory of the man everyone missed. In private, he talked about Elvis with a kind of reverence, as though speaking of a brother he never met but somehow understood. He, tell young musicians in his congregation, fame isn't the prize, peace is. And he'd mean it. Once, during a small gathering after service, a woman approached him with tears in her eyes. She held out a photograph of her late mother standing with Elvis backstage in the 70s. She loved him, the woman said softly. She said he had the kindest heart she'd ever seen. Bob looked at the photo for a long time, his thumb brushing over Elvis's smiling face. "He did," he said quietly. "He really did." Then he handed it back and walked away before she could ask another question. People talked about that moment for weeks, not because of what he said, but how he said it, with the kind of certainty only someone who'd been there would have. Still, he insisted on staying small. No big productions, no elaborate stage lights, just a wooden pulpit, a microphone, and a gospel choir that sang from the heart. He believed truth didn't need spectacle. It just needed sincerity. But the whispers kept growing. "Look at the way he moves his hands. Listen to that laugh. Even his mannerisms match." The church parking lot started filling with out-of-state license plates. Some people came for faith, others came for confirmation. Bob greeted them all the same way, with kindness, a firm handshake, and eyes that seemed to look straight through the noise. One Sunday, a man from Nashville showed up wearing an Elvis shirt and carrying a camera. After service, he cornered Bob near the back exit. "I gotta know," the man said, voice shaking. "You are him, aren't you? You just changed your name." Bob smiled sadly. "Brother, if I were Elvis, don't you think I'd have a better haircut?" The man laughed, embarrassed, but his eyes filled with tears anyway. "You sound just like him," he whispered. Bob placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then maybe what you're hearing isn't me," he said gently. "Maybe it's the part of him that still lives in all of us, the part that wanted to love people better than he loved himself." That answer never went viral, but maybe it should have. Sometimes late at night, when the church was empty, Bob would sit at the old piano near the altar. He'd press a few soft chords, humming quietly to himself. The sound echoed through the dark sanctuary, lonely yet peaceful. He'd close his eyes and let the music carry him somewhere beyond memory. He didn't need applause. He didn't need proof. The song was enough. He once told a friend that music was the only language that never lied. "It tells the truth even when we don't want to," he said. Maybe that's why his voice carried so much weight, because it wasn't trying to impress anyone. It was simply trying to tell the truth. And yet truth has a strange way of becoming myth when people are desperate to believe. For every person who admired Pastor Bob for his faith, there were 10 more trying to turn him into something supernatural. They'd say, "Look how private he is, that's guilt. He knows too much about Elvis's life, it can't be coincidence." But the irony was almost divine. The more he tried to point people toward God, the more they worshipped him instead. There were nights when he sat awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what it meant to be known. To be seen not for your soul, but for a shadow cast by someone else's memory. Maybe that's why he always preached about humility, not as an idea, but as survival. The line between identity and legacy had blurred long ago. He could feel it every time a stranger's eyes lingered too long, searching his face for proof of a miracle that didn't exist. But instead of resenting it, he turned it into something else, compassion. Because maybe those people weren't crazy. Maybe they were just missing someone who once made them feel alive. He never corrected them harshly. He never mocked them. He just kept showing up week after week, preaching about forgiveness, grace, and the kind of love that outlives fame. Deep down, he knew that's what Elvis had always wanted too, to be remembered for something pure. When the boy asked that question in church, it wasn't just curiosity. It was every rumor, every video, every sleepless night condensed into a single innocent voice. And Bob's silence that morning wasn't evasion, it was reverence. Because the answer didn't matter. The message did. After all, maybe the greatest mystery wasn't whether Elvis lived on through Pastor Bob Joyce. Maybe the real miracle was that his spirit, his kindness, his music, his longing for peace, found a way to keep singing through someone who understood. And as the congregation left that morning, whispering and wondering, Bob stayed behind. He stood at the pulpit, eyes closed, whispering a prayer that only he could hear. The same one he said every time the rumors resurfaced. Lord, let them see you, not me. And somewhere, faintly, as the church door clicked shut, the air seemed to hum with a familiar melody. Not loud, not grand, just a whisper of a voice that once changed the world. It started quietly, just a whisper across the internet. A clip here, a photo there. Someone had filmed Pastor Bob Joyce singing How Great Thou Art during a Sunday service, and by the time the video finished buffering, a new storm had already begun. The comments multiplied faster than anyone could count. That's him. Elvis never died. He found God and changed his name. Some mocked it, others wept. But all of them listened, because even through a cheap phone microphone, the voice carried something sacred, something hauntingly familiar. Overnight, Grace Point Church became a destination. A tiny wooden chapel tucked away in Benton, Arkansas, suddenly stood at the center of a global mystery. People drove for hours, some for days, just to sit in the back pew and hear that voice in person. They came with cameras, with notebooks, with tears in their eyes and questions in their hearts. Bob tried to treat them like any other visitor. He'd shake hands, smile politely, and say, "I'm glad you're here for worship." But most weren't there for worship. They were there for proof. And that's what began to wear on him. The questions weren't about God or forgiveness anymore. They were about Elvis. Was he alive? Why didn't he age like other men? Why did his speaking voice sound identical to those old Graceland interviews? They'd quote timestamps, match vocal frequencies, show side-by-side photos on their phones. One woman even brought an old 1970s autograph and begged him to write her name, just so she could compare the handwriting. He obliged because kindness was easier than confrontation. But as she turned away crying, Bob felt a weight settle in his chest. It wasn't anger, it was sadness. He knew these people weren't chasing a hoax, they were chasing hope. Something in them refused to believe that the person who once made the world feel alive could ever truly be gone. They needed Elvis to still be here, singing somewhere. And now that longing had found a vessel, him. At first, Bob thought it would pass. He told himself the internet had a short memory, but weeks turned into months and the stories only grew wilder. A popular radio host claimed to have confirmed that Bob Joyce matched Elvis's DNA from a napkin left at a diner. YouTubers uploaded hour-long analyses isolating his sermons, counting every thank you and aha as evidence. It became entertainment, a living myth that fed on attention. Meanwhile, Bob kept showing up every Sunday, trying to preach about humility and faith while people in the front row filmed him on their phones, whispering to each other. "Watch the way he smiles. That's exactly Elvis." He'd catch the flash of a lens, pause, then continue anyway, because walking off the stage wasn't an option. But when the lights dimmed and the crowd left, he'd sit alone in the pews, the echoes of his own voice still hanging in the air. He'd wonder what if the thing they saw wasn't entirely wrong, not the man but the message behind him. Elvis had always searched for something higher, something pure. Maybe in some strange way that spirit lived on through the songs Bob sang, not reincarnation, resonance. He told himself that sometimes to make peace with the myth, you had to understand what created it. One evening, a local news crew arrived unannounced. The reporter, young and eager, waited outside after service with a cameraman. "Pastor Joyce," she called out, "people are saying you're Elvis Presley. Would you like to address that rumor once and for all?" He stopped mid-step, sighed softly, and looked at her. "Ma'am, if I were Elvis Presley, don't you think I'd have a bigger church?" They laughed, but the sound was brittle. He shook her hand and wished her well, but later that night he couldn't sleep. The image of her hopeful eyes lingered. Everyone wanted answers, yet he knew the truth wouldn't satisfy them. If he said no, they'd accuse him of lying. If he said yes, the world would descend on his doorstep. Either way, faith would be replaced by fascination. It's a strange kind of loneliness, being believed in for the wrong reason. The congregation began to change. Some longtime members left, tired of the chaos. Others stayed, convinced they were witnessing something divine. Every Sunday, new faces filled the pews, some crying before he even spoke a word. After one service, a woman approached him shaking, clutching a faded photo of herself as a teenager outside Graceland. "I prayed my whole life for a sign that Elvis found peace," she said, voice breaking. "And then I heard you sing." Bob didn't know what to say. He just held her hands and whispered, "Maybe peace finds us in unexpected ways." She nodded through tears, convinced she'd just spoken to the man she'd loved since she was 16. That night, he sat by his window, listening to the cicadas hum through the Arkansas dark. He thought about Elvis, the man beneath the legend, the human behind the halo. He imagined how heavy that crown must have felt, how lonely it was to be adored by millions but truly known by none. And he realized something painful. What people were giving him now was the same worship that had destroyed Elvis then. The irony cut deep. Online, the obsession had turned manic. A video claimed to have proof because Bob's left-handed strumming matched Elvis's rare chord inversions. Another insisted his speaking cadence in sermons matched Presley's 1977 interviews down to the syllable. Someone even showed up to his home one evening, camping outside in their car with binoculars. The police came. He didn't press charges. He just asked the man, "Why are you doing this?" The man's eyes filled with tears. "Because I lost my wife last year," he said. "She loved Elvis more than anything. If there's even a chance he's still alive, I just want to tell her spirit that I found him." Bob stood there in silence, the porch light buzzing softly above. He could have called it crazy. He could have sent the man away. Instead, he placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Then tell her you found peace instead. That's what matters." The man nodded, crying openly now. Bob watched him drive off and whispered a quiet prayer. Compassion came easy for him, but lately it came with exhaustion too. Because no matter how much love he gave, it never seemed to be enough to silence the noise. Inside his home, framed verses lined the wall, reminders of faith over fame. But sometimes, late at night, he'd find himself humming old melodies, not out of nostalgia, but memory. Songs about longing, redemption, loneliness. The kind of songs that never really belonged to one man anyway. They belonged to whoever needed them most. Still, the tension grew. He noticed strangers at gas stations staring too long, waiting for a sign. Once a woman reached out to touch his hand and whispered, "I just needed to feel if you were real." Another time, during a church potluck, a teenager asked for a selfie with Elvis, and his mother didn't correct him. Everyone laughed, but Bob's smile faded quickly once he turned away. He started journaling again, pages filled with verses, questions, prayers. "Lord," he wrote one night, "how do I preach humility when people want to worship me?" The ink smeared under his palm. He pressed his eyes shut. Maybe this was the cross he had to carry to remind people that faith isn't found in idols, but in truth. Yet the irony followed him everywhere. Recordings of his sermons hit millions of views, not for the message, but the mystery. "Listen at 3:12, a commenter would write. "That's exactly how Elvis said, 'Thank you very much.'" They were listening for a ghost when the gospel was right there in front of them. Even his closest friends didn't know how to help. One of them, an older deacon, told him after service, "Bob, maybe this is God's way of using the legend to spread his word." Bob smiled faintly. "Or maybe it's his way of testing mine." He was tired, not physically, but spiritually. Every rumor, every photo, every headline chipped away at something sacred. He'd always believed in serving quietly, unseen. Now his faith was being broadcast through the same lens that once devoured a man named Elvis Presley. The circle felt complete, and that terrified him. The church staff tried to protect him. They closed comments on videos, turned away journalists, even asked him to address the rumor publicly once and for all. "It's getting out of hand," one said. "You need to tell them the truth." But Bob just looked at her gently. "And what if they don't want the truth?" That was the moment he realized this wasn't about him anymore. It was about the world's need to believe in something impossible. Then came the letter. No return address, no signature, just neat handwriting on white paper. "If you are Elvis, I forgive you for leaving. I just hope you found God before the lights went out." He folded it carefully, sat back, and stared at the ceiling. For the first time, he let himself cry. Not for the accusation, but for the ache behind it, a stranger reaching out to a ghost, still hopping for closure. The next Sunday, he stood before the congregation, voice steady but softer than usual. "You know," he said, "sometimes people look for miracles in faces or names, but miracles aren't found in who we think someone is. They're found in what love can still do after the world stops believing. Somewhere near the back, a woman sobbed quietly. But despite his words, the storm outside only grew. Reporters called. YouTubers showed up with hidden mics. Some fans even speculated that his reluctance to deny the rumor was proof he was hiding the truth. They didn't understand that silence wasn't deception, it was mercy. Because if he denied it outright, they'd say he lied. If he embraced it, he'd lose the one thing he'd built his life around, peace. And so he carried both truths like twin burdens, the myth and the message, the ghost and the gospel. Sometimes he'd look out at the packed church and wonder what Elvis would think if he saw this circus, if he'd laugh, cry, or fall to his knees. Maybe all three, because fame and faith were never meant to share the same stage. The breaking point came one humid summer morning. The service had just ended when a man in a leather jacket burst into the aisle, shouting, "I know it's you, Elvis, just admit it." Gasps filled the room. The man's eyes were wild, desperate. "You can't fool me, I've studied your eyes for 20 years. Before anyone could react, Bob stepped forward, calm as the eye of a storm. "Brother," he said softly, "you've come a long way to find someone who's already gone." The man froze, chest heaving. "Then who are you?" he whispered. Bob's voice didn't tremble. Someone trying to live the way he should have. The words hung heavy in the air. The man's shoulders dropped, tears spilling freely now. Bob guided him outside, arm around his back. The congregation watched, silent. For the first time, they saw the toll, not the rumor, not the resemblance, but the weight of expectation pressing on a single human soul. That night, Bob prayed longer than usual. He didn't ask for the storm to stop. He asked for strength to keep standing in it. Because sometimes faith isn't the absence of chaos, it's the ability to keep singing through it. And somewhere in that quiet Arkansas night, with crickets singing under a bruised sky, he whispered to the darkness, "If Elvis were still here, I hope he'd understand." Maybe he would. Maybe that was the point all along. The church was full that morning, packed so tightly that latecomers stood along the walls, their faces lit by soft beams of sunlight pouring through the stained glass. You could feel the air trembling, heavy with something unspoken. Outside, news vans lined the gravel road, their antennas poking at the sky like metal weeds. The whispers had turned into obsession, and now the myth was walking right into Sunday service. Pastor Bob Joyce stood behind the pulpit, Bible in hand, but the weight of 1,000 eyes pressed against him. They weren't here for the sermon. They were here for confirmation. He began to speak, voice calm and steady, but beneath that stillness was exhaustion. "Let's begin with a prayer," he said softly. The congregation bowed their heads, but the silence that followed wasn't peace, it was suspense. He prayed anyway, for patience, for understanding, for the strength to be heard beyond the noise, and as his voice echoed through the small church, you could almost hear it, that same timbre, that same warmth that once shook arenas to tears. It wasn't Elvis's showman voice. It was something purer, stripped of glitter and fame. And then it happened. The question that had been hanging in the air for months finally broke free. A child's voice, innocent, small, trembling. "Pastor Bob, are you Elvis?" The crowd gasped as one. The sound rippled through the church like wind through leaves. Even those who'd sworn they'd never speak it aloud looked up now, waiting. The child stood near the front, the same boy from before, clutching a small Bible against his chest. His mother tried to pull him down into the pew, whispering an apology, but Bob raised a gentle hand. "It's all right," he said. He stepped down from the pulpit, his shoes soft against the old wooden floor. Every creak seemed to echo an eternity. He walked toward the boy, eyes kind, movements unhurried. And when he knelt, the entire congregation leaned forward as though the answer might finally reveal itself in that moment. Bob smiled faintly. "Why do you want to know that, son?" The boy hesitated. "Because when you sing, it feels like he's here again." That was it, no conspiracy, no proof, just feeling, the kind of truth only a child can see. Bob exhaled slowly, his hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder. "That's a beautiful thing to say, thank you." He paused, his eyes lifting toward the cross at the front of the church. Then in a tone so gentle it barely carried beyond the first few rows, he said, "But son, Elvis was just a man. The love he sang about, that's something real. That love never died." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was sacred. People didn't breathe. Some tried to smile, but tears betrayed them. The boy nodded, small and solemn, as if he understood more than anyone else in the room. Bob straightened slowly, his eyes glistening now. "You know," he continued softly, "people ask me sometimes if I ever met Elvis, And I tell them the truth, I meet him every day. Every time someone forgives, every time someone chooses kindness over pride, that's when I see him, not in a face, but in a heart. Someone in the back began to sob quietly. The sound of sniffles spread like rain. He walked back toward the pulpit, but every step seemed to carry the weight of two lives, the one he lived now and the one the world kept imagining for him. He turned to face them, his voice trembling with truth. "If you came here looking for Elvis Presley," he said softly, "I can't give you that. But if you came here looking for hope, well, you're in the right place." That broke something open. The congregation rose to its feet, some clapping, others praying, a few just standing still, eyes wide with disbelief. The child's mother wept openly now, hugging her son as Bob bowed his head again. What happened next became a legend of its own. Someone recorded it on their phone, and by nightfall the video had spread across the world. Millions watched as a pastor in a small Arkansas church knelt before a child and gave the most human answer possible. Not a confession, not a denial, but a lesson in grace. Comment sections exploded. "That's him. Only Elvis could speak like that. He's preaching through another name," others pushed back. "It's just a kind pastor with a good heart." But everyone, believer or skeptic, said the same thing. The moment made them cry. Bob didn't watch the video. He didn't need to. He felt the energy shift that day. Something had lifted, even if only for a moment. But fame, even accidental fame, has a way of finding you again. A week later, reporters came knocking. Networks called. They wanted interviews, exclusives, proof. He turned them all down. "There's nothing to prove," he told one persistent journalist. The truth already spoke. But the truth never silences curiosity, it just deepens it. More people showed up. The parking lot filled before sunrise. A woman from Germany flew in, saying she'd dreamed Elvis told her to visit this exact church. Someone else left a bouquet of roses by the door with a note that said, "Welcome home, King." Inside, Bob tried to keep preaching like normal, but the atmosphere had changed. Every word was dissected, every movement recorded. He could feel it, the line between ministry and myth growing thinner. That Sunday, he preached on identity. "Who do people say you are?" he asked the congregation. Some said John the Baptist, some said Elijah, but Jesus asked, "Who do you say I am?" He paused, letting the words sink in. "You see, what people believe about you doesn't define you. What you believe about yourself does." It was meant as a sermon, but it sounded like confession. Afterward, a man waited by the door, eyes wet. "Pastor," he said, "I don't care who you are, but today I saw Jesus in you." Bob smiled, but his chest tightened. "That's the only person I ever hope you see." He locked the church late that night, the echoes of the service still haunting the air. Alone in the dark, he walked up to the pulpit and ran his fingers along its edge. There were moments he felt strong, untouchable. But there were others when the weight of it all pressed too hard. How do you serve God when the world insists on worshiping you? He sat down, head in his hands. In the distance, thunder rolled across the sky. For a fleeting second, he imagined the stage lights of 1977, the cheers, the endless noise. And then he thought of the quiet now, the simplicity of this life. No fame, no spotlight, just faith. Maybe this was the peace Elvis had been searching for all along. He whispered into the empty church, "Lord, if this is what you wanted, help me bear it." But the storm outside grew louder, and so did the noise online. The viral video hit television. "The pastor who might be Elvis," one headline read. Overnight, millions of strangers debated whether salvation and resurrection had somehow met in Arkansas. It would have been laughable if it weren't so tragic. Because behind the clicks and views was a man just trying to live quietly, a man who'd given up everything for peace, only to be chased by ghosts he never asked for. One evening while closing up, he noticed the same boy from that Sunday waiting by the steps with his grandmother. The boy smiled shyly. "I wanted to say thank you," he whispered, "for what you said that day." Bob crouched down. "Did it help you understand?" The boy nodded. "Yes, sir, I think I know who Elvis really was now." Bob raised an eyebrow. "You do?" The boy smiled. "He was someone who wanted people to feel loved. That's what you do too." Bob's throat tightened. "That's a pretty good answer, son." The grandmother placed a hand on his shoulder. "You gave him peace," she said softly, "and maybe yourself too." That night after they left, he sat alone once more, but this time there was no weight, just stillness. The truth was simple, maybe too simple for the world to accept. He wasn't trying to be anyone. He was trying to remind people what love could sound like when it was honest. Outside, the cicadas sang. Inside, he hummed an old tune under his breath, something about valleys and peace. The melody rose and fell like a prayer. Some say a man named Elvis Presley died in 1977. Others say he didn't. But maybe the truth lives somewhere in between, not in a grave, not in a rumor, but in every act of grace that outlasts the spotlight. And maybe that's what people saw that day, not a ghost, but a glimpse of redemption. Because when Bob Joyce looked into that child's eyes and said, "That love never died," he wasn't just talking about Elvis. He was talking about something eternal, the piece of divinity that survives inside every broken human heart. He'd never confirm it, he'd never deny it. He didn't need to. The truth was never meant to be proven. It was meant to be felt. And so he kept preaching, kept singing, kept loving. Week after week, even as strangers wept in the pews, searching for the king, they ended up finding something far greater, grace. And somewhere, maybe in heaven, maybe just in memory, the man once called Elvis Presley smiled too, because the music hadn't stopped. It had simply changed key. The clip of Pastor Bob kneeling before that child spread like wildfire. Within days, it was everywhere, shared on Facebook pages run by fans who still lit candles every August, analyzed by believers, mocked by skeptics, embraced by everyone in between. But what no one expected was what came next. The story didn't fade, it grew. And it didn't just stay online, it reached hearts. People wrote letters from every corner of the world. Some were addressed to Elvis Presley, C.O. Heaven. Others simply said, "To Pastor Bob, thank you for reminding us what love sounds like." The church mailbox overflowed. One note written on pink stationery in trembling cursive said, "I've spent 40 years missing him, but when I heard you say that love never died, I realized maybe he never truly left us at all." Bob read them all, every single one. Some made him smile. Others made him set the letter down and wipe his eyes. Because even though he'd never asked for this connection, he could feel something bigger moving through it, something that had less to do with identity and more to do with healing. Soon, people started describing strange moments of peace after watching the video. "My father and I hadn't spoken in years," one woman wrote. "We watched your sermon together and ended up praying for the first time since he got sick." Another said, "I don't know if you're Elvis or not, but that message pulled me out of depression. It reminded me that there's still good in the world." It was as if a door had opened, not to prove a conspiracy, but to reopen the part of humanity that still believed in grace. And maybe that's what Elvis had been chasing all along, a kind of grace the stage could never give him. Bob's sermons began to shift in tone. They became quieter, more intimate, less about scripture and more about the spaces between it. Forgiveness, compassion, identity, the ache of being misunderstood. He'd often pause mid-sermon, gaze out over the pews, and say, "Sometimes God uses confusion to draw people closer. Maybe we spend too much time asking who someone is and not enough time asking what they're showing us." Those words stayed with people. They lingered long after the music stopped. Even the skeptics, those who mocked or called it all performance, couldn't deny one truth: people were changing. Attendance doubled, then tripled. Local hotels started offering Grace Point Sunday discounts. The town, once quiet and half-forgotten, found itself on the map again, not because of spectacle, but because of something rare: sincerity. But with growth came new shadows. Cameras showed up again, so did opportunists. They called it the Elvis Resurrection. They sold T-shirts, keychains, even fake tickets promising "Meet Pastor Elvis." Bob begged them to stop. "This isn't what it's about," he said, but the more he resisted, the louder the world became. Still, every Sunday he kept preaching. Sometimes the noise outside was so loud he had to close the doors during worship. But inside, something sacred remained untouched, a fragile, glowing peace that lived in the stillness between songs. One afternoon, after a particularly crowded service, he sat alone in his office and looked at the old guitar leaning in the corner. It had belonged to a friend, gifted to him years ago. The wood was worn smooth from decades of use. He picked it up and started playing softly. The chords came out like a whisper, slow, tender, nostalgic. Without realizing, he began humming the words to "Peace in the Valley." Halfway through, he stopped and laughed under his breath. "Lord, they'll probably say that's proof too," he said aloud. But then his expression softened. Maybe that's okay. Because somewhere deep down, he'd made peace with the rumor. Maybe it wasn't meant to be disproved. Maybe it was meant to remind people that faith and mystery often live in the same breath. That sometimes not knowing is what keeps the wonder alive. In one of his last interviews, one he reluctantly agreed to with a small Christian radio host, the interviewer asked, Pastor Bob, how do you feel about being compared to Elvis after all these years? He paused for a long time before answering. It's humbling, he said, because I think people aren't really looking for Elvis. They're looking for the part of him that was pure, that part that believed in something bigger than himself. And if hearing me sing helps them find that again, then maybe that's God's way of redeeming the pain that fame caused. The host went silent, then whispered, "That's beautiful." And maybe it was. Weeks later, the same clip began to circulate. Not because of the rumor, but because of the message. A preacher talking about redemption using the language of rock and roll. People called it the gospel according to the king. Letters kept coming. Songs too. Poets, fans, and believers alike wrote about it. It wasn't about proof anymore. It was about connection, that invisible thread between what once was and what still could be. For Bob, that connection became a kind of quiet legacy. He started a community project using the donations the church received from viewers around the world. Instead of expanding the building, he used the funds to feed families, repair homes, and sponsor music programs for children. If Elvis stood for anything, he told his congregation, it was using your gift to lift someone else higher. He smiled when he said it, but everyone in the room knew what he meant. Every year on August 16th, the anniversary of Elvis's death, people gathered outside the church to sing. No stage, no microphones, just voices in the open air. They'd sing Amazing Grace, then end with a soft, trembling chorus of Can't Help Falling in Love. No one led it, it just happened. Like the music itself was remembering. Reporters called it the revival that never ends. But Bob never called it that. To him, it was just people finding peace in melody. One evening after the crowd dispersed, he lingered by the door. The setting sun painted the sky gold and violet. He looked out at the empty parking lot and thought of Graceland, the mansion filled with laughter once, now a museum filled with ghosts. He thought about all the people who'd loved Elvis not for his fame, but for how he made them feel. And he realized maybe that's what God had been doing all along, taking something once worshipped for fame and turning it into a vessel for faith. He whispered to himself, maybe the king finally found his kingdom. A few feet away, a woman was lighting a candle near the steps. She smiled when she saw him. "Pastor," she said softly, "my husband passed away last year. He loved Elvis since he was a boy. I brought his old concert ticket to leave here, just feels right somehow." Bob took the small, worn ticket gently. The paper had yellowed with time. "He was lucky," Bob said, voice thick. "Why that?" she asked. "Because he got to live in the days when music still had a soul." She smiled through her tears. "It still does," she said. "You just reminded us." That night, Bob wrote in his journal. His words were simple. Maybe the real resurrection isn't in flesh, but in spirit. Maybe the legend lived just long enough for the message to survive him. He closed the book and stared out the window. Crickets hummed. A soft breeze rustled the curtains. Somewhere in the distance, he thought he heard faint laughter, the kind that belonged to another lifetime. Maybe imagination, maybe grace. He didn't need to know which. Years later, when he grew older and his voice turned softer, he still sang. Every Sunday, without fail. People said his voice carried something timeless, not because of who they thought he was, but because of what he'd become, proof that even legends can turn into shepherds. And when he finished each sermon, he'd pause before stepping down and say one simple line that everyone knew by heart. "If Elvis were here today, he'd just want you to know one thing: you're loved." Those words traveled far. They outlived the rumor, the videos, the noise. They became something else entirely, a promise. A reminder that behind every myth is a man, behind every man a message, and behind every message a truth so simple it almost feels divine. The world kept changing. The internet forgot. But the people who'd been touched by that story never did. Because even decades later, when someone stumbled across that old video, the pastor, the child, the question, they still felt it, that ache, that hope. That tiny, miraculous whisper of faith that refuses to die. And maybe that's what immortality really is. Not endless breath, but endless echo. The kind that keeps returning long after the song itself has ended. The camera lingers on the empty church. The sun has set. Only the sound of distant singing drifts through the air, faint, eternal. They say truth lives somewhere between the stories we tell and the ones we're afraid to believe. Maybe that's why this one still moves people. Because it asks more questions than it answers. Was it really Elvis's voice that morning, or was it something greater speaking through him? And does it even matter if the message changed lives? If you don't want to miss the next hidden truth behind the legend, subscribe now, stay with us when we uncover the next chapter of faith, fame, and the mystery that binds them. Because sometimes the real resurrection isn't about coming back to life. It's about teaching the living how to feel alive again.